Hello, students. We're going to be looking at chapters 8 and 11 today. So chapter 8 is identity construction. And so what this chapter talks about is the fact that, historically in psychology, we're trying to look at the self, identify who you are um, as sort of a stable um, ideal. And so, you kind of are who you are, and that doesn't change much throughout your lifetime. Um, it talks about the notion of the singular self and personality, which over time we've recognized how that doesn't seem to fit because when we look at people that way, we look at them as being like autonomous individuals. However, they're then responsible for dealing with internally all of the stuff that's impacting them. And so instead of looking at all of this stuff and saying, some of that needs to change or some of that is the issue, it's all looking at the person as an individual in ways that they can kind of create change. And we know that that's not always possible because external factors have a huge impact on us. And so one of the quotes I wanted to pull out is skeptics maintain that because liberal humanist doctrine has portrayed persons as autonomous beings who are primarily responsible for their plight, practitioners within this field may easily dismiss how racist, sexist, and homophobic discourses impact them and their clients. And so it kind of takes us away from all of those systemic and environmental factors and only has us focus solely on the person, which we know is not the best way to help someone or kind of work with them either. So in comes postmodern psychology. And so postmodern psychology looks at the link between the wider intercultural processes and individual identity construction. And so postmodernism is a term applied to a loose collection of intellectual movements in a variety of social fields stretching well beyond the social sciences. So kind of think about that definition. The understanding is that when we look at anything, it really is a coming together of a unique set of circumstances within a specific time and place. And so when we take the current climate, that's going to have an impact on how we construct our identities and how we're seen by other people. And so that in and of itself cannot be static because there's constantly changing factors, right? Like there's new technology and new beliefs and ideas and thinking and stuff like that that are going to have a big impact. And so many counseling models will emphasize the primacy of the rational mind over body and emotion and its capacity to take up one non contradictory position. But postmodern theorizing has emphasized the significance of the person as a multi position subject, a view quite contrary to the unitary notions of the self. Postmodernism has tended to challenge all boundary fixings and the hidden ways in which people subordinate, exclude, and marginalize others. And so it takes those socio historical and political um, factors into account. And so the self, from this perspective, is considered to be in a constant state of change and disequilibrium. And therefore, our self, our identities cannot be quite stable either. And so the question of who are we, who am I, becomes increasingly difficult to answer in lives that we lead and in the way we describe ourselves within any new time frame. So within, the current context with which we live. And so there are multiple identities and multiple selves. And so to assert that the person has a single identity means to believe that they have a fundamental allegiance, often, race, religion, creed, whatever, and kind of flaunt it in the face of others. But every person is actually a meeting ground for many different allegiances. And so as we talked about intersectionality in detail last week, this makes sense in light of that, right? Sometimes these allegiances conflict with one another, and this confronts the person with difficult choices. And so, an example can be religion when that sort of conflicts with maybe sexual or gender identity. Um, and how does a person deal with that conflict in their identities? And so there's multiple ways that that can sort of happen. And so the reality is that people sort of change over time and we adapt and we grow, right? And so not all of those identities are exactly static. And so rather than privileging or emphasizing the understanding of people as a singular identity, we prefer to view the person in terms of complex relational processes manifesting themselves in the context and the site of an individual body. And so within all of these contexts, we manifest ourselves. To be this singular being. So the term that your text uses is relational selves, um, and as a way of describing the complexity that we each hold within our human identity, um, which makes sense, right? Because who we are in ourself is related to all of these other factors in our world. So it's relational. So the self as a speaking voice is not an individual voice at all, but a voice that has been shaped by collective and cultural experiences, carrying the collective stories that people tell one another. And it becomes critically important to trace relationships within the context of cultural histories to understand how contemporary identities are formed. And so, a lot of the work we've done in this textbook is look at historical context, right? And so you can't really look at individual identities specifically within the United States without looking at the context with which we've gotten to this point, because the United States is such a uh, so unique in the ways that it was kind of formed and developed. And so there was this researcher, Maria Root, who proposed a Bill of Rights for people who identify themselves as belonging to multiple categories. And what it does is it seeks to give people permission not to identify as others would expect them to, but to identify themselves differently in different situations. And so, based on the situation I am in, I may identify very differently than as if I'm in a different situation. And so rather than having to subscribe to a particular category of identity, you kind of go with what makes sense or what's a fit in a given situation. And so this approach goes to the heart of building what we've talked about, across this textbook is bridging across that us and them divide. And so within a specific situation, I may identify very differently than some of the people I'm in that context with, but I may also identify very similarly in other ways. And so recognizing how that might change. The textbook goes on to talk about border identities, which is used to describe a situation where a definition of a culture group establishes a boundary with which a person is not considered to be a member of that group anymore. And so it's a defined border where you might say, like, on this side of the border you identify this way, and on this side of the border you identify another way. So it's kind of how we divide people up within these categories. But there are people who don't really fit into either of those categories. They kind of straddle that boundary, or kind of live very close to it, don't really fit into either category, or kind of fit into both in a way. And so that is what the term border identities mean. And so particular ideas about culture are functioning in ways that create divisions amongst people who may actually share common cultural histories. And so we share this common cultural history, but we're dividing ourselves among these kind of created boundary lines. And so, if postmodern critiques have disturbed the comfortable assumptions about culture that have become commonplace, then they are gradually giving way to a new view of culture that is more fluid and less essentializing, kind of makes those boundaries a little bit more wavy. The postmodern concept of culture has become more pluralistic or polyphonic. Um, the writers of the text want to emphasize the value of speaking in terms of cultural narratives that run through people's lives, rather than thinking of people as identified in a one-on-one or one-to-one correspondence with a particular cultural identity. And so, like, what different identities run through my life and my experiences versus, again, that singular identity. And so the use of narratives to uncover the modern workings of racism can be really important. And so I think we've kind of talked about this semester, the importance of narrative therapy, um, and how we can include that with individuals of many identities and cultural backgrounds. So essentialist thinking invites people to judge each other's cultural worthiness in relation to established essential norms. And so again, kind of creating those boundaries that we have to, um, kind of find ourselves on one side or the other of. An important danger of this kind of thinking is that it invites a polarizing stance and tempts people to judge the worthiness of others' experiences, including their experiences of discrimination and oppression. And so, this can kind of look like, where people are like, I didn't have that experience. And so they invalidate other people's experiences. Or they even kind of try to engage in the oppression Olympics, which, doesn't really get us anywhere. And so a therapeutic process must really honor the integrity of those different interconnected cultural contexts within which people's multifaceted ways of being are expressed. And so this in complex, changing, and often contradictory patterns of power relations. Our identities are not fixed or essential, although they are grounded in our lived experiences and are not free floating. So we can't just kind of, like willy nilly, like pick identities out of the air. But they really are grounded in the experiences that we have, the way that we see ourselves, others see us, others treat us, and the experiences that we go through. And so, from an intercultural perspective, the power differentials that divide humanity into those us and them categories are problemized so as to find alternatives to connect and work together by recognizing the contextual and fluid nature of our identities. And so, granting significance to the social context which we inhabit and their impact on the shaping of identity contrasts starkly with individualistic theories and context independent analysis of the self and relationships. And so this is very different from the way that we are used to seeing things. Your textbook continues to talk about the importance of language. And so, because our understanding of the world does not come directly from an objective reality, the role of language really becomes pivotal. And so, language is really more than how we communicate with one another, but the meanings that we create. And so, language tends to structure our experience of ourselves in the world and produce meanings and concepts that make up us. And so, when you think about, cognitive behavioral therapies, so like REBT and stuff like that, it does talk a lot about meaning making and belief systems and kind of schemas that we have about the world. And our language is important in that. And so, paying attention to language and the importance of the words that people are using and the way that they describe things is also very important. And so, again, this kind of goes back to the idea of narrative therapy being helpful, but also really challenging clients to think about the words that they're choosing to use and what meaning might be behind that, and also not making the assumptions that we completely understand what a client means when they're using certain words. Another issue with language is that built into the structure of some language forms are social hierarchies that give clear directives to language users about what is allowed to be expressed within the culture. And so, what do we have words for and what do we not? And how do we talk to younger people or older people? And things like this. And so this can vary greatly between people, depending on the language that they speak, and if they speak multiple languages, and then you as a counselor, what language do you speak, and things like that. And so this can have a really big impact. The chapter goes on to start talking about the counseling implications of pathologizing and challenges for holding on to multiple expressions of identity, which we have talked about before in this semester, especially when it comes to the DSM, is that when people come to us, they're going to have different cultural beliefs and expectations and things like that. And it's not, it's necessary, I guess I should say, for us to not pathologize individuals for those cultural beliefs or practices, but to help them to feel comfortable in the things that they're doing, and us to be more understanding of where those things are coming from, which is one of the struggles of, in some cases, having to give diagnosis at day one. Like, you don't fully understand the person's context or their culture in that first session. And so a lot of times people with mental illness in general have been kind of categorized very singularly. So like they are this identity because of this mental illness that they may be struggling with or have been diagnosed with at some point. And so, Chex really wants to draw attention to how the proliferation of mental illness categories and the diagnoses and treatments associated with them have really diminished people's identities and disrupted their ability to live with non-pathologizing facets of their life. And so, in some ways, they've been othered, or I could even say we've been othered. Anybody who has been diagnosed in some way with a mental illness or a diagnosis. And so the categories are not always to diminish individuals suffering from the illness. Sometimes it is to kind of separate them and segregate them from, other maybe normal people. Mental illness and diagnosis treatment are often serving the need of the dominant culture group and have really oppressive consequences. And so we have seen that historically in the institutions and stuff that individuals were put into, and the treatment of mentally ill individuals with really drastic means like electroshock therapy and lobotomies and all kinds of experimental methods that were used on individuals um, in mental hospitals. So again, it kind of talks about this: we are normal, successful, and good, and they are sick, bad, and a failure. And so the history of mental deficit language has really been driven throughout the mental health profession. And how can we really look from a strength-based perspective instead? And so interculturality is therefore at stake by the universalization of articulations of experience by single professional terms that may be used in our field. And so there tends to be that ongoing bias right from the very beginning of white women and women of color, as well as minoritized groups. And so, when you think back to the work of Freud and stuff, the hysterical woman, and even, the fact that homosexuality was a diagnosis in the DSM for so many years. And there are definitely hierarchies of discrimination, denaturalization patterns of interdependence, and expanded area of self-depreciation. The historical process may be viewed as one of progressive infirmity. And so a lot of the tools that are even being used by professionals in our field often, really other people with mental illness, and it's important for us to focus on practices that build bridges for people struggling and help them to live their best lives without separating them. Relational dynamics are tracked for both individual problematic patterns of relating as well as relational patterns of resilience. So again, that strength-based approach and how this person is doing well and has these supports or has these resiliency factors that have gotten them to this point so far. And so they identify this term relational intelligibilities and how we can focus on them. Survivors started to really challenge the attitudes and behaviors that have been going on and brought up this idea of recovery is possible and building a recovery oriented system, which is really important for us to continue to promote. Shared decision making between healthcare professionals and the clients, self-directed care. And so how can we really work to partner with our clients instead of being like, I'm here and you're here and I need to tell you what to do and dictate how you need to do it. So remaining curious about the complexity of individual lives presents counselors with many more therapeutic possibilities, which is amazing. Um, because the DSM, invites us to really look at what's happening within the individual instead of, sort of outside of them. We need to recognize that while it's really an important instrument in some ways, it really is looking through that Eurocentric culture. And so that idea needs to be taken into account every time that we deal with the DSM and someone who is not from the Eurocentric culture. So intercultural theoretical orientation pays close attention to homogenizing systems of power that compromise our rights of being. And we can be open and curious to explore the interconnectedness across culture from where we learn about our identities in contrast to the identities of others. So rather than just, like, we're here and we're the same and they're different, just being able to open that bridge and be able to learn through the interconnectedness that we have. An intercultural lens renders visible the contrasting descriptions of people's stories about their identities and the monocultural conceptualizations of personality theory. And so, from the intercultural perspective, identity construction could therefore be characterized in plural terms as identities and in outside in rather than inside out. So, how can we kind of look at the context and then work our way in versus work with the individual and then look out? And so new contextual factors across cultures will emerge and invite us to reconfigure ourselves. Our response may be to fall back on old habits or find the wider contextual factors so compelling that we don't have a choice but to make a different and new response. Our lives are often so complex that integration and wholeness need to be abandoned as therapeutic goals. A more helpful therapeutic response and way to work with our clients would be to embrace multiplicity and to normalize the experience for those who are troubled by their multiple identities. And so holding space for this and that, both and rather than either or. And recognize ways that we can incorporate our identities with one another instead of having people kind of, you know, forced to choose between one or the other. It's pivotal to recognize that the boundaries surrounding ethnic membership are in constant state of flux and are not firm and stable. People everywhere have to respond to the complex and contradictory intercultural forces that run through their lives, whether they want to or not. And so, again, this chapter, like some of our others at the end, has a response, but it also has some good information, a good little case studies and stuff throughout it. So, you want to make sure that you're taking a look at those as well while you're going through the chapter. And then the other chapter that we looked at this week is chapter 11, which is on the globalization of identity. And so it's a little bit of a different way to look at identity. We talked about the construction of it, but how can we look at the impacts of globalization? So, globalization tends to produce common habits, shared cultural norms, and common knowledge systems across diverse cultural populations. And so, there are some pros and cons of this that your textbook talks about. It is a controversial phenomenon. It's a contemporary process identified with the accumulation of power in the hands of a limited number of people. And so, those, maybe not people, systems, organizations, companies, whatever, will kind of dictate for everybody else the way things are supposed to be. And people are supposed to sort of assimilate or accommodate towards that. And so there ends up being a lot of evidence that links globalization with cultural hegemony. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about throughout this chapter, ways in which globalization can kind of blend cultures and inevitably kind of take away from more minority or marginalized cultures because the ones that have this sort of power dictate what the culture needs to look like, if that makes sense. And so it was warned in the 90s, the late 90s, that globalization could be dangerous because it floods third world with cultural artifacts from industrialized countries, which lead to homogenization and subsequent global impoverishment. The global interconnected space of communication is producing new forms of knowledge and new knowledge cultures in which knowledge is exchanged in increasing rapidity. So very quickly changing things and spreading information. And so one product of global interconnection is that human societies are tending to become less and less differentiated from one another. And so the things that once made different cultures and stuff, societies very unique and different, it ends up making them less and less different and everybody kind of looking a little bit more similar in their choices and maybe clothing and behaviors and things like that. And so cultural products emanating from both West and East intermingle, resulting in a hybrid form of cultural expression. And so the impact, um, it impacts social processes right now all over the planet, leading to profound changes in how we experience things and even how we identify. And so cultural knowledges are being subjected to the processes of assimilation and hybridity. Hybridity. And so it talks about the way that there's the horizontal and vertical influences of culture. And so the the um the vertical ones are from, the generations. And so you get those culture from different generations within your society, within your group, within your family. And the horizontal is that you get from your peers that may be from different cultural backgrounds or societies or things like that. And so we have both of those impacts, both of those heritages that work within us, right? Both the horizontal and vertical ones. And so the cultural inheritance that most people habitually invoke is the vertical one. In age of globalization, vertical cultural groups often attempt to assert their differences more fiercely in order to ensure that their cultural identities stay distinct. And so that ends up becoming a real big challenge when you're being influenced by, your current environment and your current peers, but then your family kind of has these expectations that there are cultures and traditions that they want to continue, and feeling the conflict from those different places. And so your text talks about three major global processes that have a big impact: migration, proliferation, and influence of mass media, and the growth of technology that they go on to explain. And so migration obviously is, occurring, has always occurred, but obviously it's occurring at, sort of skyrocketing levels in today's world, in today's society. And so there's not only, moving between different countries and things like that, but also like um, within nations and countries, there's a lot of mobility. So here in the United States, obviously we have different states that you can move between, or cities, and in other countries they may move between different cities as well. Um, Migration also looks very different than it used to. And so people tended to, have no option historically to acculturate when they moved to a new area. It required them often in some, to some extent, severing connections with, family and people from the past, their culture, and all of that, and kind of taking on something new. But now that acculturation isn't as necessary, now that we can remain connected with people who live far away and connected to different aspects of our cultural heritage and things like that. And so it's evident that the world no longer operates as if cultures and communities are isolated from one another, right? We continue to have that contact. And so people are continually examining and in some cases modifying their own lifestyles and cultural ideas as they're attracted to and embrace new ways of thinking and new modes of life. And so it can be ways to sort of branch out and learn different things and new new things. These dramatic changes in physical location simultaneously produce profound social, psychological, and cultural changes. And so thinking about, individuals who may be fleeing other countries and coming to the United States, they're often subjected to new hardships to adjust to the cultural life and structural inequalities that are prominent in our country. And these communities experience profound ruptures to their traditional ethnic identities as younger family members attempt to acculturate more and more to the majority norms within the country. And as we've described before, our country is dominated by European American middle class cultural ideals. And so many young people end up acculturating to that instead of um, continuing to promote or practice their family traditions. or cultural traditions. There's also social impacts as well, living in a very different place. So, how do I adjust from, rural life to more city life, different types of work and jobs, and just different availability to resources and education. Um, Many new immigrant mothers and fathers work long hours, leaving their kids, either alone for long periods of time or to take care of one another. This chapter in particular has a lot of really great like case studies and little vignettes in here. So make sure that you read those throughout this. And so counselors should maintain a position of non-judgmental response to the personal and cultural experiences that individuals may be bringing into the counseling room. It's not a counselor's job to engage the enforcement of legality anyway, but to care for the experiences of the client, no matter what their status might be with authorities. And so, um, if there are individuals who are here depending on their status and documentation, that's not really for us to um, get involved in, um, kind of reporting people and I guess I shouldn't say that. We need to report people for safety reasons, but we don't need to get involved in a family's legalities and things like that. And so it's explained a little bit more in this vignette. So hopefully you'll understand that as you read through it. Migration can take a terrible toll on family because they may be leaving one oppressive culture but coming to another that's treating them harshly, unfairly. There can also be stories of courage and resiliency, and we can definitely, as counselors, draw from that to help the individuals, create their cultural narratives and new cultural formations within the new context that they find themselves in. There's a lot of psychological effects as well of having to leave your place of origin, and and the different reasons why can have a big impact on that. Refugees will often suffer anxiety around fears of being sent home, delays in processing applications, running into conflict with immigration officials, and not having permission to work. These challenges often give rise to poverty, hardship, psychological stressors that come with lack of resources. Refugees commonly experience poor access to healthcare and counseling services when they need it most. They faced adaptation, assimilation difficulties, loss of culture, isolation, loneliness, and boredom. And so it's not something that should be taken lightly by any of us individuals, but especially us as counselors working with individuals. Because of the dramatic changes in physical location, many extended family systems become stretched, if not ruptured and fragmented. Um, Given the powerful social and economic forces operating around the globe, people's cultural identities are increasingly being shaped by their access or exclusion from economic resources. There can be impacts with religious beliefs, and so they may be exposed to different religious beliefs and have maybe more options that they could potentially choose faiths that are different than their ancestors or grandparents, which could be seen as a good thing that they have more options, but it can also be really difficult and challenging within families. So family counselors working with immigrant families may encounter the playing out of those themes in people's lives with great frequency, and um, difficulties between generations because of the migration. It also talks about the indigenous renaissance, kind of talking about, this people moving to a new atmosphere, acculturating to dominant patterns of communication and modes of life, um, losing, your mother tongue because you have to learn a new language that is, your mother tongue isn't used around you as often, or you don't have to use it as often. Um, Children tending to move away from indigenous roots and joining mainstream cultural communities. Um, the indigenous people in this country have made great efforts to revitalize their culture or traditions that were taken away from them, stripped from them, and recreating a new form of education about those practices is really important. And so, by acknowledging the historical trauma of colonization and recreating education in a manner that promotes indigenous values, indigenous people have been making great strides in healing from the harmful and long-term effects of colonization, or working to um, revive their culture. Again, a lot of these things have been taken from them, kind of forced assimilation and acculturation. And then there's also the changing identities. It's argued that globalization is owned by only some people. And so, how does that end up affecting what we take on and what we don't? Next, we get into consumerism and culture and how that can impact individuals, moving from more communal and collective cultures to more individualistic values and consumeristic societies, looking at corporate culture and how that plays in and how different that can be with individuals who are moving from one environment and one culture to another. Also, the different identities that can be produced in Hollywood, not only our expectations of what other people could be like, but also how we ourselves are portrayed and how people might um, um, kind of judge us or assume about us based on those things. It talks a lot about gender as well in there and how the different identities of men and women are portrayed and have been portrayed and some of the changes that are taking place. Um, Next, we get into the second category that was identified: the pervasiveness of Western media. Um, and so, many shows that are on the air now illustrate cultural practices that hinge on competition, individualism, materialism, powerful cultural forces that are shaping cultural identities in all communities throughout the world. And so, how's the popularity of some of our shows here in America impacting the world overall, um, and changing some of the cultures? How do we perform new identities that we may take on and start to shift towards? And then the way that media and poverty kind of portrays the gaps between the haves and the have-nots, and um, how that sort of escalates the culture of consumerism, needing to have these specific things that show our level of being a have. And then the third one that we talked about, technology. And so how we have very different access to technology now than we ever have, and it's become very global. But also the way that technology is impacting the poor. And so how around the world, cellular technology has been kind of spread, but can also have a really negative impact when there's so much focus on technology that not everyone does have access to. Excuse me. Um, And then it gets into the counseling implications specifically of globalization. So, human identities are obviously produced through complex social processes that we've talked about. And there's lots of influences of that. While we're concerned about the tendency to overstate the unique needs of one ethnic group in comparison to others, we don't want to lose sight of the real effects of systemic patterns of oppression that have targeted particular ethnic groups. Within single families, the counseling needs may be very different from one member of the family to another based on their intersecting identities and ages and things like that. Um, Young people are increasingly exposed to the horizontal culture we talked about with from peers, which may take many social cues and cultural guidance from those, and kind of be very different um, than if they hadn't migrated. Given the speed of cultural change, many children are brought up in very different culture than their parents, right? Things move very fast, as we see with technology and different changes in our current society. Counselors need to be equipped with more than singular ideas about cultural belonging in order to make sense of what the clients are experiencing, and to have conceptual framework that enables us to identify the complexity of competing background cultural discourses that really are shaping the family's interactions and producing conflicts potentially within them. Um, Obviously, we need to work on case to case basis because every individual and family is different. Um, we need to have the recognition of how the horizontal culture can have a negative impact on the elderly, because in collectivistic cultures, typically the elderly are well taken care of, but in more individualistic cultures, they're not. And so that switch may have led older folks not to plan for their future because they thought they would have younger generations to help take care of them. So we may have that role as counselors and therapists to help older folks navigate that, and kind of help them to find resources. Um, Also, gender relationships and how that a lot of times is changing within relationships and stuff, as people may take on non-traditional roles or learn about non-traditional roles and want to make changes to their existing relationships. And so counselors might have a role in helping couples and families navigate those changing um, roles and expectations, dating practices and sex, different expectations that may be present there. Um, Counselors and therapists who wish to work with new cultural communities may need to develop a working knowledge of cultural norms and dominant discourses that prevail within those systems, to build trust and be able to be effective therapeutically with those individuals and communities. Um, the increasing focus on material values and associated Western obsession with body appearance and shape are powerful cultural themes that many counselors and therapists need to contend with. Um, we need to take seriously the cultural influence on clients' lives, and should develop an appreciation of the complexity of cultural narratives that impact the identity development that we all are going through and experiencing. We need to understand especially profound influence of media, technology, and mass migration on the shape of different identities. And so again, want to kind of say that's a really good part of this chapter is kind of identifying the ways that we as counselors may have to intervene and stuff. And so that's it for that chapter. Again, at the end, it does have a response to it, and well, both of these chapters have some case studies and stuff like that in it, but particularly 11 does. And so that's chapters 8 and 11. You will see a video again from me. Wait, two more, 12 and 13, and then chapter 14. So see you all again soon. Thanks.